Welcome to the Australian Hiker Podcast, Australia's longest running hiking podcast, downloaded over 500,000 times in over 145 countries and providing you with an Australian perspective on all things hiking. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage.
This is episode 195 of the Australian Hiker Podcast. And in this week's episode, we talk about what podcasts do I listen to. Before we get into today's episode, if you'd like to help support Australian Hiker and this podcast, there are a couple of ways that you can help us out. Firstly, by subscribing on your podcast host of choice so that each episode is available as soon as it's published. And if you have the opportunity, leave us a 5-star review. Another way to support us is go to the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au and click on the Support Us page and buy us a coffee. You can do a one-off donation or become a monthly supporter. All donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue producing this podcast and blog. Now let's get on to today's episode. Late in 2021, the Australian Hiker Podcast turns 5 years old, making us the longest running and most downloaded Australian hiking podcast. But what hiking and outdoor related podcast does Australian Hiker listen to? In this episode, we provide a brief overview of what's on my podcast listening queue that covers a range of different styles. We hope you enjoy. Now, before we talk about podcasts specifically, I'll just sort of give you a brief overview of my listening habits, I suppose, for want of a better term. I do not listen to podcasts or music when I hike. I prefer to be out in nature. But for me, I walk in most cases to and from work when I'm physically at my workplace. And that's 3.75 kilometres each way. So over the period of the week, I listen to roughly around about 11 hours worth of podcasts.
That's a lot of podcasts.
That's a lot of podcasts. And I think it puts me in the upper end of podcast listeners, but certainly not by a long way. Whereas from Jill's perspective...
No, I've got a 5-minute drive. There's not a lot of podcasting time in that.
And I think I tend to be more of a podcast listener than Jill does.
Yeah.
So, from my perspective, I've got plenty of time to walk to and from work. I actually go out and walk at lunchtime as well, which is another half hour's worth of walking, and that's when I get all my podcast listening time. I listen through Apple Podcasts, basically because I've got an Apple device, or all my devices are Apple. And even though I can use other options for listening, Apple just seems to be an easier process to listen through. And in fact, certainly looking at the statistics, the Australian Hiker Podcast is downloaded roughly around about 60 to 70% through some form of Apple, whether it be through Apple Podcasts or through some other mechanism associated with Apple. So I think certainly most people seem to be geared towards Apple these days, at least from a podcast perspective. Now, in relation to podcasts that I listen to, from a hiking perspective, there's 7 hiking-related podcasts that are on my listening list, and there's also a number of others that aren't hiking-related.
That's probably why I don't listen to the podcast, because you've tortured me with the others.
So I'm going to go through these podcasts and just provide a brief overview in alphabetical order and talk about why I listen to each of them and what I think is worthwhile about them. There certainly has been over the last 5 years a number of other podcasts that I've listened to, but there's a number that have come and gone, which is usually the way. And in fact, most podcasts have a life expectancy of around about 7 episodes. So if you get beyond that as a podcaster, you're doing pretty well. So the first podcast I'm going to talk about is Backpacking Light. This US-based hiking podcast covers a range of topics, including equipment, outdoor recreation, and trail discussions. At the time of this podcast episode, Backpacking Light has recorded 44 episodes, and they release roughly one or more on a monthly basis. The average episode is around about 45 minutes in length, and the style really is very technical and formal. They go into in-depth discussions about gear reviews, much more than we ever do on Australian Hiker. So if you're a real gear freak and want to know the minute details, this is a good option to work through.
That's a gear freak in a good way. Yeah?
It is, yeah. Now, backpacking tend to be based on a subscription service. So if you want the full details and the full reviews, you do need to be a subscriber. But certainly you can get enough information out of just listening to the podcast itself. There are 2 co-hosts, and they usually involve guests. And as I said, it tends to be a very technical and very formal sort of style. The next podcast that I listen to is Backpacker Radio, and this is produced out of a blog called The Track in the USA, and their focus is on long-distance trails and through hiking. They've so far released 116 episodes, releasing anything up to 3 to 4 episodes a month, but it does vary, and the average length of the episode is around about 2.5 hours. Presentation style varies quite wildly, and I'll say typically they tend to be best classed as light-hearted in nature, sometimes silly, sometimes serious, and everywhere in between. So it really depends on the content and the topic, and it's one of these sort of things that I think most people would find this reasonably enjoyable, but again, it's aimed at long-distance hikers. Usually presented with 2 co-hosts, and again, often with guests. Number 3 on my listening list is Real Trail Talk. And this is an Australian hiking podcast. It covers a range of topics with a focus on trails, in particular Western Australian trails, although they do actually cover trails from other states as well. And they also touch on other recreational activities such as mountain biking and every so often other activities as well. They've released 80 episodes to date, and their frequency is around about 2 episodes a month. But this does vary. Sometimes they'll go a number of weeks without a podcast. It really depends on what their time availability is. Now, again, the presentation style is quite friendly and relaxed and is presented by 2 co-hosts, again, often with interviewing guests and other guests involved as well. One of the newer podcasts on my listening queue is the Snowies Camping Show. And again, this is an Australian-based camping podcast which focuses on car camping, 4x4, caravanning, and also hiking. But to date, in the 26 episodes released, certainly the focus has been very much on car camping. They release on average just under an episode on a weekly basis, and the average length of each podcast is 25 minutes. The presentation style is friendly and relaxed, providing information in an easy-to-understand format. Usually, again, this is presented by 2 co-hosts who are staff from Snowies, and they all often interview other guests as well. Now, from here, we shift to the UK, and this is the Outdoors Station. Now, the UK hiking podcast, The Outdoors Station, covers a range of topics with a focus on self-powered travel. So that includes hiking, paddling, cycling, anything to do with human-driven forms of movement. So far, they've released 538 episodes since they started in 2005. And the host used to be a radio presenter in a previous life, and it comes across that way. He's a very professional presenter. It's
very polished, isn't it?
Very polished, and best compared to David Attenborough. Now, that might be because he's got the British accent that just doesn't. But, it's almost that radio sort of voice. So, really it's a pleasant thing to listen to. Now, Bob, who's the host, usually presents by himself. Occasionally he'll have his wife co-hosting, but it pretty much tends to be him. And usually he's interviewing guests as well. And I think from memory, the podcast has been downloaded over 10 million times in the last 16 years. Frequency tends to vary. Sometimes it tends to be weekly, but then it'll go a number of weeks or even months without an episode. So I think we're August now. I think the last episode released this year was in February this year, so it has been a number of months. But then all of a sudden he'll pop back up again and do a series of episodes in a row. So it really depends on availability of time and what's going on. Now we go back to the US again, and this time it's to the US-based Trail Show, and their focus is on long-distance hiking with their motto being more beer, less gear. It covers a range of topics, typically on longer trails. They do beer reviews, They also do tent peg reviews, and they've been doing tent peg reviews for a number of years now. And it's
Who would have thought there were that many tent pegs to review?
Well, it's pretty rare that they actually review tent pegs. Quite often it's tent peg alternatives. So I think one episode they talk about burying a phone as an anchor to hold your tank in place. So they I mean, really from a point, and this sort of leads us on to the presentation style. It's lighthearted in nature, often silly, and probably can be best described as irreverent. You're either going to like this sort of style of presentation or you're not. The silliness sometimes you can do without, but then when they're talking about trials and doing reviews on particularly in the case of US trials, it's information you tend not to pick up from anywhere else. So it's actually quite good in that respect. The episodes vary in length, but they tend to average around 2.5 hours. I think the longest episode has been 4 hours.
Whoa. They'd want to be entertaining for that.
They only tend to release an episode once a month. And in that respect, it's the sort of thing that I have listened to all the episodes. I think there was one which they deliberately did on sound effects. And they occasionally get given a hard time on the sound effects they used in their podcast. So I think they deliberately released a podcast just on sound effects. I didn't listen to all that one.
What kind of sound effects?
Well, it was just the cricket noises and the clapping and the laughing and that sort of thing, just an entire episode on that. And I think that was actually an April Fool's Day episode. So it's the sort of thing, again, it's another phrase that comes to mind here is dirtbag. The hosts on this episode or this show are all Triple Crown hikers, which means they've done the Pacific Crest Trail, the Continental Divide Trail, and the Appalachian Trail. So they've got a good hiking resume. But these days, as they've gotten a bit older, I think their hobby tends to be more the podcast rather than the hiking. But again, it's a sort of thing, it's a very different style. You're either going to love it or you're going to hate it, but it's worthwhile listening to just to see what you think. One of the newer episodes or the newer podcasts to come to air more recently is a podcast called Walking Distance. And this is a sister podcast show to Backpacker Radio, again, coming from the track, US-based, focused on long-distance hiking. And I'll say this one is a bit more niche related. So it often covers topics relating to long-distance hiking that isn't covered anywhere else. They release 2 episodes a month and they average around about 30 minutes in length. And the presentation style is, I'll say, more pleasant and more professionally presented. So when you listen to this, it really is a very professionally done and professionally polished podcast. And it's the sort of thing, they haven't released many episodes. I think to date they've released, I think it's around about 13 to 15 episodes so far. And it's interesting, it's different. And if you're into long distance hiking and don't want the silliness, I suppose, and the brevity, this is a good podcast to listen to. And again, very enjoyable to listen to as well. That's just a brief overview of the episodes that I tend to listen to. And from my perspective, I listen to these podcasts for a number of reasons. Sometimes it's just a bit of light-hearted release. When you get sick of listening to news and you just want a bit of levity just to break up the day. And sometimes it's just for a bit of inspiration. These podcasts and other podcasts I've listened to give me ideas for the Australian Hiker podcast. I'll often take ideas and turn them into something that's relevant for an Australian audience. So it's actually a good way of thinking about things. And even if it's not something I directly translate into Australian Hiker, sometimes it will give me ideas, provide topics I hadn't even thought of, even if it's not a topic of the podcast I'm listening to. But it'll make me think and it'll make me realise that, hey, this is something that might be relevant to what I'm doing.
You know, and I think for everybody, it's a way, particularly at the moment when we're struggling to get out to do some hiking, it's a way to stay connected and stay interested and even develop your knowledge while you've got time, as in time not doing the hiking. So, the podcasts do add a lot of value, and I think one of the values that they add is about inspiring people to hang in there, because we'll be able to get out again soon.
One of the things that's happened in podcasts over the last sort of 12 to 18 months is a lot of people have gone towards YouTube, where they'll actually record the podcast on YouTube and they'll be presenting it live, because quite often the presenters are in different locations because they couldn't get together because of COVID. And then they'll take that audio and turn it into an audio podcast that'll get uploaded onto Apple and any other podcast hosting service. So it's a different sort of mechanism. And certainly from my perspective, it's something that I've always tended to avoid because...
Yeah, we're not doing YouTube.
No. I spend 20 hours a week as it is on Australian Hiker, not including hiking. And it's the sort of thing where I don't need another 2 or 3 or 4 hours to add on top of that.
I just didn't want people to know that I was sitting here drinking a glass of wine. Sometimes, not always.
And I think the other thing as well is, listening or watching a podcast on YouTube has its advantages. So when you're talking at something, you can hold it up and say, here's a tent peg, here's a pack, whatever the case may be. But if you're walking or mowing the lawn or painting the house or doing something else, not having that visual there really isn't necessary. Being able to listen is certainly something that's we've preferred to sort of keep towards.
And I think it helps develop your imagination a little bit, so you start to develop your mental pictures about what you're listening to, and I think that's a good thing, actually. So, big question, Tim, what's your favourite?
I think it actually does vary. I don't think I do have a particular favourite. I'll find that an episode from a particular show will be really good. I must admit, I do like the Snowy's camping podcast. We upgraded our four-wheel drive a couple of years ago. We're travelling to further afield, and while we might actually park in a campground and then go hiking, it's just a different opportunity to actually get out and do some hikes further afield. So looking at options for car camping has been quite helpful in that respect. And while a lot of the episodes that have been released so far are very much car camping based, it's certainly been one of those things that, again, it prompts me to think about what else I can do for Australian Hiker. I think one of the most interesting episodes I picked up from them was talking about how much weight you can put on a roof rack on a four-wheel drive.
Yeah.
And, you see some four-wheel drives that are so weighed down and so heavily loaded on roofs, but there is actually a limit. And if you overload the roof rack on a car, on a four-wheel drive, your insurance company may not cover you if you have an accident. I hadn't actually realised that.
Yeah, some of them look as if they're so high up. They look as if they're about to tip over, don't they?
Yeah.
So on a four-wheel drive road, or a road where you need to use four-wheel drive and it's a bit bumpy and there are lots of dips and what have you, and really experienced four-wheel drivers would know about this, but it's certainly something for new starters to think about.
One of the reasons I do listen to a number of American-based podcasts is, as I said, I have the Pacific Crest Trail on my bucket list. Now, when I get to do that is anybody's guess. I'd also like to do the John.
You could probably leave the country. You just won't be able to come back.
Well, that's it. I'd also like to do the John Muir Trail, which is a section of the Pacific Crest Trail. And it might be something that I end up doing, or we end up doing, because it's a bit more reasonable to manage, and it's the sort of thing that this sort of keeps me enthused and keeps me thinking about these trails whenever it is that I get around to doing them. And certainly listening to the US-based podcast, they're the ones that are doing these trails, and you hear some really interesting stuff about trails and tracks that you're just not going to come across unless you actually visit the states themselves. So, yeah, I think I find that there are individual podcast episodes from all of these podcast shows that I do find really interesting. So now one comment I will make here, the Americans do tend to speak a bit slower than Australians do. So I do.
Or at least you do.
At least I do.
Yeah.
So I think I often will listen to the US-based podcasts on 1.5 speed. I just cannot get through, as I said, listening to 11 hours worth of podcast episodes a week. When you've got 2.5 hour episodes being released, it fills up that time quite quickly. So I think I got, just before I went on the Tasmanian trail trip, I actually managed to clear my inbox of episodes, but I've now got around about 19 or 20 episodes to catch back up on again. And if I'm honest, that includes Australian Hiker. So I go through and record the episode, I'll listen to it as part of the editing process, and then when I walk to work the next day, I'll listen to the episode as well, because listening to it as everybody else is going to listen to it gives me a good indication of what it really does sound like.
Yeah, I must admit I struggle with the 1.5 speed. Mine's probably 1.25. I just get a little bit irritated with some of the speedy versions that Tim listens to.
One of the reasons I think that I wanted to do this episode was people often say is that we've listened to all your episodes, when's your next episode due out? And realistically, we aim for around about 3 episodes a month, and that's really the capacity that we've got. So if you want your hiking fix, by all means, please listen to Australian Hiker first, but have a look at some of these to see if they might be something that would enthuse you. As I said, there'll be something in there for everyone, even if there's some you don't like, but give them a try at least once and see what you think. Okay, that's all for this week's episode. We hope you've enjoyed. Bye for now.
And bye from me.